The occurrence border took its time leaving the system. A whole day of it, in fact. There were 3 reasons for our lack of speed. Firstly, the tech priests Jim had duped were seriously hindering any pursuit. Secondly, our bloody escape from the station, and the news that we'd been the source of the psychic attack had really discouraged the few small independently owned ships that didn't rely on the Mechanicus to keep running. Finally, the locals' priorities had shifted drastically after a virulent fungal infection had started spreading through the station, driving men insane with visions and melting through just about anything. We actually felt a little bad about the whole warp fungus thing, but it really wasn't our fault, and it seemed like they managed to get it contained before the stuff ate more than an eighth of the station. Anyway, Hannah had been looking into the stuff after the Marines had stumbled into it, and was pretty sure that it would die off, or at least lose its hallucinatory properties, without frequent exposure to the warp. So it would probably all work out in the end. And in the short term, it brought us a little more time to prepare for the upcoming weeks of warp travel. The last of our preparations were finished an hour before we were scheduled to re-enter the warp, and at Sarge's insistence, we all wandered down to our Geller Field adjacent quarters for a pre/post/whatever mission briefing. Tink and Damie were off on one side, enjoying their usual pastime of antagonizing each other. The subject this time was the Tauvids Tink had acquired, specifically the ones that had been based on our exploits on the buffer worlds, and were supposedly earning us all sorts of royalties. Amy was loudly explaining that they were stupid, heretical, and concrete proof of Tink's perversion. Tink was holding that all of this was untrue and that Amy was just jealous that she hadn't been included in the vids on account of being stuck on an island with a crazy Magos at the time. Doc was slumped over the table in the middle of the room. The medic had been on duty for nearly 20 hours, and he'd been concussed and half crushed. And when he'd gotten back to the ship, he hadn't been allowed to take a break. He wound up spending another 20 hours hopped up on stims, helping get Gravis stowed away and treating all the armsmen who'd been injured during the defense of the ship. Doc was completely out of it, and Nubby had taken the opportunity to draw some comical facial hair on him. The little trooper was augmenting his doodles with a pyramid of furniture balanced on and around Doc, and was gleefully egging Tink and Amy on. Twitch had taped up what he claimed was the only accurate map of the occurrence border's tainted sections on one wall. I say claimed because none of us could read the damned thing, and looking at it for any length of time made our heads hurt. Twitch was alternately sticking pins in the map and talking to a servo skull with a det pack strapped to it. Supposedly, the Cogitator Adept was watching the skull's vid feed and answering Tink's questions via combead, but none of us could really be sure. Finally, Fumbles was sitting in a corner of the room, grimacing at a small Tau drone with a block of white material strapped to it. Fia was sitting on the far side of what was definitely a blast shield, excitedly taking notes. None of us really paid much attention to Sarge when he finally arrived, since Amy was chasing Tink around the furniture pile by that point, but that changed when Sarge dropped the large crate he was carrying with a hollow-sounding boom. Nubby recognized the crate, sidled away an appreciable fraction of the speed of light, and Fumbles, who could taste the rage boiling off Sarge, rather more literally vanished from sight. Before either of them could make their escape, Sarge barked an order at Twitch, who pressed a big red button on the wall marked Panic. As the exits sealed and a few dozen proximity mines activated, the foul-smelling blur that was Nubby changed direction, and vanished through the only door left, which led to the bathroom. He locked the door behind him. Sarge ignored the bathroom door and the hard-to-look-at corner where Fumbles was whispering at Theo to shut up about amazing readings and hold still. He turned his attention on the rest of us, and with a horrible fixed grin, asked for a status report. Twitch and Amy hesitantly reported that about half of the boarders trapped in the tainted areas had been killed, captured, or found dead. The rest had either holed up in areas too dangerous to pursue, disappeared into the rat's nest of corridors, or just outright vanished. Patrols and traps had been set to contain the demonic feeding frenzy that would occur in those areas when we entered the warp. Tink followed this up with a report on the generally good condition of the cells after the overhaul, and confirmation that everything was ready for entering the warp. Finally, Doc was poked with a stick until he gained enough consciousness to confirm that Gravis was still alive, and that the looted medical supplies would be enough to keep him that way for a few weeks. Sarge digested the 3 reports for a few seconds, and then poked Doc awake again. In an almost gentle voice, he asked the medic if he knew how Gravis's other half was doing, because Sister Valerie said she couldn't find the freezer crate with the Space Marine's legs anywhere. Doc's tired brain kicked into overdrive and dredged up an image of a dented and bullet-pocked crate being pulled off him and tossed to the side. He swore, attempted to leap to his feet, and was buried as the pile of chairs around him collapsed. Tink, exhibiting all the tact and self-preservation instinct of a socially retarded lemming, burst into laughter. Sarge's attention immediately shifted to Tink. He opened the crate he'd carried in, took out the manifest taped to its lid, and skipped down the section labeled Miscellaneous. His false grin completely gone, Sarge asked Tink if he knew where 1. Data slate, Fecundia pattern, 1. Astartes grav chute and grapple harness, 2. Single-shot grav flares, and 1. Mark 7 power armor helmet could be found. Tink's poker face lasted until the helmet was mentioned, and he involuntarily glanced towards where Spot was sitting. He looked back to find that Sarge had somehow teleported across the room and was now practically nose-to-nose with him. Then the shouting started. Of course, despite all the shouting, and the part where he dragged Nubby out of the bathroom and held him in the air by one leg, Sarge wasn't really that angry. Even though he'd grown rather stodgy since his promotion, he was still a guardsman, and he knew all about the importance of recycling. The truth was that after how badly our resupply mission had gone, he'd just needed to shout at someone, and the way we'd scavenged, disassembled, sold, or just plain lost a Space Marine's worth of war gear and legs was as good an excuse as any. We put up with Sarge's stress-relieving tantrum and thanked the Emperor that he hadn't found out about what the power sword had actually been traded for. I mean, Theo claimed that the chunk of Wraithbone was extremely valuable and the key to all sorts of psychic engineering, but he didn't actually have any idea how it worked or what he was going to do with it. Sarge finding out that we'd lost the power sword because our captive Xenos wanted to commit some science on a spooky rock would have resulted in some real shouting. So, once Sarge had started feeling better, and had mandated that Sister Valerie was now in charge of Gravis's bolter and what was left of his helmet, he brought the rest of us up to date on what he, the Adepts, and the Captain had decided. The gist of it was that we hadn't appropriated enough fuel to reach the system where Oak's lab was, so we were going to make another stop and would offload Gravis, send a message to Oak, and repair whatever damage the zoanthrope had caused by that point while we were at it. Our response to this news was conflicted at best. We knew that we'd be wanting another pit stop by that point, but we really didn't want to go through all that shit again, and since the astropaths were telling everyone that we were Inquisition impersonation heretics, it seemed inevitable. Sarge assured us that he, or at least the smarter people who worked for him, had figured out a solution, though. The theory was that the astropaths' lies would catch the attention of the Inquisition pretty quickly, and they'd send out a team to investigate what had happened on the station. Unless paths managed to purge all records of our visit, which would probably require killing pretty much everyone in the administratum from the prefect on down, it'd be relatively easy for the Inquisition to identify us based on vid recordings of Sarge and the ship, and determine that the astropaths were full of shit. Then, after a judicious amount of purging, they'd send out a follow-up sector-wide message to clear our names. The nearest Inquisition outpost was 5 days away from the station, so call it a week to hear about the problem and travel to the station, another week to sort things out and send the all-clear, and a third week just to be safe. The captain had mapped a route that wouldn't be too far off course and would take us to a nice, developed Imperial system with an inquisitorial outpost of its own, just in case, in about 3 weeks. We'd de-warp really far out, so if the Zoanthrope did its head-explodey thing again, it probably wouldn't kill anyone, and then discreetly venture into comm range of the planet to make sure everything was okay before attempting to dock. It was a nice, sensible plan, and all we had to do was keep the Zoanthrope contained and Gravis alive for 3 weeks of warp travel. Everyone, except Twitch, accepted that it was the best option available, and we all went off to make our last preparations. 2 hours later, the Geller field kicked into gear, the warp drive tore a bloody hole in the fabric of reality, and what we fervently hoped was our second-to-last warp journey with our stupid psychic bug began. All in all, taking everything into account, and relatively speaking, the trip went well. You know, by occurrence border standards. Especially if you ignore all that ominous stuff with the ghost Tyranids. Doc, per usual, went most of the trip in the medbay looking after Sergeant Gravis. The bisected Space Marine's condition wasn't good. The Tyranid bioweapon that had been introduced into his system was unquestionably alive, and was constantly attacking what remained of his organs with a wide variety of poisons. Gravis's Space Marine biology was fighting back, but was seriously hindered by the gross trauma he'd suffered, not to mention the loss of those organs in his lower torso. The only thing keeping Gravis alive was his power armor's automated Medicae system, a large pile of life support machinery, and regular aid from Doc and Sister Valerie. Since he didn't have an entire medbay to run, Doc handled Gravis most of the time. Sister Valerie covered for him when he was occasionally needed elsewhere for more combat-oriented medical duties, and after a week of increasing grumpiness on both their parts, her senior subordinate was put in charge of the night shift. Anyway, between Doc's steadily increasing experience treating the torsified Space Marine, and the large amount of medical supplies we'd requisitioned from the waystation Alimentum Primaris, Gravis was kept, if not stable, at least only gently teetering on the brink of death. Initially, that is. While Doc babysat Gravis, Sarge evaluated his performance during the supply run. He was reasonably happy with the way things had gone after everything had fallen apart, but it seemed to him that a real interrogator would have been able to keep things from spiraling out of control in the first place. He eventually came to the uncomfortable conclusion that his current social skills were rather lacking, and since the Emperor, or at least his Holy Inquisition, had dumped him into a role which required them, he was going to have to fix that. With an incredible amount of reluctance, Sarge visited the Diplomacy Adept's quarters, and asked for a few lessons on the arcane arts of talking to people without shouting. The Diplomacy Adept found teaching Sarge to be rather difficult, mostly because our fearless leader was so set in his ways. In Sarge's book, deception and disguise were accomplished using stuff like helmets on sticks, camo paint, and smoke grenades. Inquiry and intimidation shared a definition, and involved little, if any, talking on his part. And the pages that covered blather and charm had been removed to make more space for the chapter that covered command. Regardless of the difficulty involved in reversing a lifetime's worth of sergeanty preconceptions, though, the two of them did make some progress as we traveled. Admittedly, it was very slow progress, and involved an awful lot of yelling, but progress nonetheless. For their part, Tink and his fellow xenoculturists made some progress of their own during the voyage. The wonder team of Theo, Jim, and Tink were in charge of zoanthrope containment, with occasional assistance from the xenologist adept and Hannah, if she was hiding from her problem-prone tech acolytes in the cells. They'd refurbished everything in record time before we entered the warp, and afterwards things had gone surprisingly smoothly. Thanks to all of the parts Nubby had acquired, the psi suppressors, shielding, and warp shroud had all been repaired and improved to the point where they were very nearly within the minimum recommended strength for containing a Delta-level psyker during warp travel. And the stasis field was working perfectly for a change. All that had to be done in these cells was a bit of daily inspection and maintenance, which was always carried out quickly because the zoanthrope had acquired an unsettling presence ever since Sarge's partially slagged shield had gotten wrapped around its head. It was hard to shake the feeling that, despite the stasis field, the eyes under the metal were watching you. Of course, the reduced maintenance requirements of the cell meant the nerds were able to spend time on other things. Other things in this instance translated to helping with important ship maintenance in Jim's case, and committing all sorts of tech heresy in Tink and Theo's. Actually, you couldn't call what Theo was doing tech heresy. It was more a case of tech heathenism, him being a Xenosenol. He was quite fixated on a piece of wraithbone we'd acquired, and spent every scrap of his free time tinkering with it. Some days he'd be wiring it into every device in the cells, other times he had it mounted on a drone and trailing fumbles through the ship. And occasionally, he could be seen wandering around with the big white block strapped to his head like a demented hat. Tink said it was all very scientific, Jim and Hannah refrained from commenting, and the rest of us were just glad it kept the mouthy little Xenos busy. Tink, deprived of the helmet he was cannibalizing to upgrade Spot, and perhaps motivated by a sense of shame at his inappropriate behavior, not likely, dedicated his time to a more practical project, the damaged Emperor Scythe stealth shuttle. During our zoanthrope acquiring trip, these ship's tech acolytes had finished defungusing it, but after that, it had just been left to sit in a shuttle bay on account of how it was completely non-functional. The fungus had eaten away a lot of armor and stealth materials, and had pretty much destroyed the landing gear. But the real problem was that a bunch of spores had gotten into the shuttle's circuitry. Some of the best piloting, navigation, and stealth control systems a Forge World could make had been reduced to hunks of corroded metal and silicon. Jim and Hannah had declared the shuttle unfixable without the aid of a fully stocked manufactorum and access to the shuttle's blueprints. Tink, however, saw the shuttle as both a challenge and an opportunity, and had snuck a few parts, of both Imperial and Xenos origin, which had nothing to do with the Psyker containment, onto the list he'd given Nubby. When he found out about the project, Sarge briefly considered yelling at Tink for scavenging more of our Emperor's Scythe stuff, but decided it did technically count as repairing the shuttle, and we were already up to our eyes in Xenotech heresy anyway. Also, there was a chance we'd get a working stealth shuttle out of it. For their part, Jim and Hannah just ignored all mention of the shuttle, and added its bay to the list of places their tech acolytes were not allowed to go. The rest of us didn't have any input on the subject because we were all either busy with Gravis or dealing with the increasing level of warp activity in the occurrence border's tainted areas. The initial high volume of anomalies and incursions had been expected. The things that usually discorporated after finding the tainted sections devoid of anything living had swarmed the trapped borders and grown strong. Several varieties of warp beasts, minor demons, reanimated corpses, and what Nubby would tell anyone who'd listen was a bloodthirster, despite its lack of height, axe, or wings, had tried to claw their way into the more habitable sections of the ship during the first few days of transit. Thanks to the fact that we'd known the general location of the borders, the unholy horrors had come through to find numerous traps, swarms of jetpack-armed suicide skulls, the hardened priests and armsmen that made up the ship's watch, and a few well-armed guardsmen waiting for them. Even with prepared positions and numerical superiority, though, tackling warp creatures can be tricky. Over the 3 days it took the last of the borders to expire, the demons and the anomalies that manifested around them took a small but significant toll on the defenders. Some men were torn apart, others went insane, an unlucky few ran afoul of the occurrence border's chronic mechanical problems, and 1 or 2 forgot to check what was on the other side of a door before stepping through it. Of course, none of us were on the casualty list. Prior experience with this sort of thing, not to mention better quality weapons and a rather pragmatic approach to questions like, "Do you think that thing with the tentacles is still in there?" meant that we made it through without significant injury. Insignificant injuries and close calls are a different matter, mind you. Something in the third wave of demons threw Fumble's powers out of whack and caused a few burns and bruises for everyone present. And then there was a hairy moment when Twitch barely stopped Amy from stepping through a door that inexplicably opened into one of his minefields. After that, one of Nubby's augmetic feet had to be plasma cut off and replaced on account of how he tried to kick a nurgling in the nadgers. Oh, and the one time Doc came down to help with the casualties, a priest he was treating tried to eat his face and had to be exorcised. See, clubbed into unconsciousness, using his own book of holy verse. Anyway, things calmed down after the 3rd day, and once the various bits and pieces had been incinerated, jettisoned, or tossed back into the tainted sections, the bulkheads were resealed and everyone got back to their usual routine. Unfortunately, things didn't stay calmed down. Over the next few days, reports started filtering in of creatures haunting the corridors near the tainted areas. This wasn't unusual in and of itself, since every time the navigator hit a bump in the warp, stuff would leak all over the ship and there had just been a demonic incursion in the area to boot. But the witness reports were worrying. They matched the ones we'd received during our previous week of warp travel.